Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell, News and Views from the Nefarium on July 18th, Thursday, 2013, in the year beyond Thunderdome. We have quite a few things to talk about today, but okay. And I want to start with a couple of announcements. Georgianne continues to do well. She needs some donations and some support. The eye surgery, I'm told, that she has to have now to correct the one that she just had is a different matter. I don't know exactly what's involved. She is supposed to go back into her eye doctor in August, so please keep her in mind with some donations and things. And I'll try and keep you posted as I learn more about what's going on. She's seeing all sorts of spider web effects inside of her eyes right now, and I guess this is due to some loose tissue or something that occurred during the previous surgery. So please keep her in mind. The other announcement I want to make is for those of you who didn't hear last week's news and views, I did finish Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations and, pardon me, Covert Wars and the Clash of Civilizations. That should be out in a couple of months. I haven't heard anything about Financial Vipers of Venice, but that's also coming out, I think, in a couple of months as well. Dr. DeHart and I are also beginning work on the second volume in Apocalypse Theater. I realize it's been about a year since Yahweh the Two-Faced God, but we are beginning some work on that. And we have some ideas that for another series of things that we want to do in self-publishing, and as we get that to work on down the line, I'll be giving you more information about that. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is three different stories, and oddly enough, they're all related. One story is about cold fusion. The other story is about China and the Yuan. And the third story is, interestingly enough, from our friends at RT concerning Dominuqe Strauss-Kahn, whom you will remember as the former head of the IMF that was ousted during a sex scandal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's start with China. There's an article that I will be linking to this news and views, and the title of the article is China Reportedly Planning to Back the Yuan with Gold. And this article is in response to some reports that are suggesting that Beijing is considering backing its currency with gold. And this follows on last week's news that I reported about the melting down of gold from the Federal Reserve and its sale to China, where it's been remelted and recast into Chinese gold bars. And I want to point out in this article one very important paragraph, and these are Russians now that are making this criticism of the Chinese move to possibly back its currency with gold. They're stating, quote, separating the yuan exchange rate from the U.S. dollar may further weaken the American currency in the long run. In addition, China's monetary policy would become very much restricted, believes Evgeny Nadorshin, chief economist at AFK Sistema, which is a Russian economic consulting firm. And toward the end of this article, it states, quote, on the other hand, the greatest danger to Russia being highlighted by most experts would be an increase in competition from Chinese commodities, which will be offered more aggressively in the export market due to the shrinking of domestic demand. What is not clear in all this story is why China should back the yuan with gold in the first place, muses Natalia Orlova, chief economist at Alpha Bank. Beijing could simply divorce its currency's exchange rate from the dollar without locking itself into the dependence on the price of gold and the amount of metal in that country, unquote. Now, the reason I'm reading those two paragraphs there is because it's very interesting that the Russians are in their own subtle way highlighting the problem that I've been suggesting with gold all along. Number one, the numbers of gold in existence are badly obfuscated, and this I suspect for a multitude of reasons. The first reason being that central banks have always obfuscated the amounts of gold that they have as a matter of security, and in some cases national security. So that's number one. They deliberately lie in order to make sure that the actual amounts of gold are not known to people that would be in a position thereby to make some sort of economic warfare against a particular central bank or its associated country. But number two, I've been stressing in recent blogs for about the past year, and again in Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations, and on some of these news and views, that there's something beyond that typical obfuscation of gold amounts. And that something is the fact that after World War II, the American national security establishment took all of that Japanese plundered gold from Operation Golden Lily and rolled it into a completely hidden system of finance, a system of finance that President Harry Truman classified top secret in I think it was 1945-46, so shortly after the end of World War II. That means that in addition to the normal obfuscation of gold amounts, you have a vast amount of gold that was kept completely off the books, so it wasn't even entering the figures to begin with. So in other words, there's a second tier of obfuscation of the actual amounts of gold, and I've been suggesting that the actual amounts could be much higher, perhaps by an entire order of magnitude. Now, that gold in turn, at a third level of obfuscation, that gold in turn was rehypothecated by the banks that were involved in this hidden system of finance over and over and over again. So the problem now is who holds the final lien on all that paper that gold has been backing out there. And I suggest and have suggested that the NSA, the vast electronics eavesdropping and data mining that they have been doing is in part and largely a financial mechanism for insider trading and so on, but also to keep track of the actual amounts of rehypothecation and fraud in the system. And that for a variety of reasons. Last week I suggested that one of those reasons was space and space collateralization. And in fact, you're going to see more of that argument coming up in Covert Wars and Clash of Civilizations. Now, all this suggests to me that I don't think China is seriously considering doing this. What I think is going on here is that Russia and China are playing a careful game, probably coordinated, and that Russia is pointing out the problem here by the amount, when it says the amount of metal in that country, namely China. In other words, they're suggesting that the figures of gold are drastically obfuscated. So in other words, this is part of a, in my opinion, a psychological operation to broaden the growing discontent and distrust in the Western financial system. That's my take on it. Now, in line with that, we have this article in RT, and I think this is really a very significant story, because it appears that the former head of the IMF, Dominuqe Strauss-Kahn, who you'll recall was ousted from the International Monetary Fund by a series of sex scandals. And at the time, I thought that he was actually being set up deliberately so that they could get rid of him, because Mr. Strauss-Kahn's policies, if you recall, were somewhat less globalistic in a certain sense than the leadership of the IMF, and that means principally the United States, really would have wanted. And now we find him in Russia. And there's a very interesting concluding set of paragraphs, two short statements at the very end of this Russia Today article. It says, quote, "The Russian Regional Development Bank, which has hired Monsieur Strauss-Kahn, might be difficult to take seriously because, quote, an American company might think that because of his sexual reputation he is actually a liability," unquote, a Moscow banker told the Times. Strauss-Kahn was previously employed at a consulting firm called Parnes and has denied any memory of the events that led to the 2011 sexual assault allegations, unquote. Now that's very interesting, because if the Russians are hiring him, you can be assured that at some level the hiring was approved or given the tacit approval of the Russian government. And yet, here we have in Russia Today a statement more or less attacking Strauss-Kahn. And I'm going to suggest that what this means is that the real reason that Strauss-Kahn has been brought into the inner circles of Russian finance is that he would probably be in a position to tell the Russians certain things about the interior policies, decision-making processes, and so on at the International Monetary Fund that they are unaware of. In other words, he's bringing intelligence with him and is able to help the Russians better understand the inner workings of the global financial elite that's headquartered in the West. And I think it's very significant for another reason that the Russians are bringing him to Russia, and that is, if you have been following the financial news lately, just in the past couple of weeks, Russia overtook Germany as the world's fifth largest economic power. So in other words, Germany has fallen in its position and Russia has risen in its position and is now the fifth largest economy in the world. So I rather suspect that what we have going on here, when you add the Russian story together with Dominuqe Strauss-Kahn, with the Chinese gold story, I suspect that you have some long-term shuffling of the pieces on the game board, so to speak, by the BRICS countries. I don't anticipate really that China is going to back the yuan with gold, at least not until other things happen. And I don't think that we need to be too concerned about that at the moment. Now, there's a final point that I want to raise this week. There's a third article I'm going to be linking on the website to these two articles. And this is an interview that was given by my friend Tim Ventura over at AmericanAntigravity.com. It's about an hour-long interview with a man that's been experimenting with cold fusion for some time by the name of Ari de Geis. All right? Now, Mr. de Geis has an interesting theory about cold fusion. I'm not going to comment one way or the other about its validity, although it appears to me, from listening to him explain it, that he's working with basically some sort of modified theory of cold fusion called lattice-assisted nuclear reactions. Now, for those of you who don't know, lattice-assisted nuclear reactions are more or less now the accepted scientific theory for the process of cold fusion. In other words, since the time of Pons and Fleischmann up until now, the first reaction of orthodox standard science was to reject their claims because their claims flew in what was known of the standard model of quantum mechanical particle reactions. But in the early part of the millennium, there was a formulation of a theory within standard quantum mechanical science called lattice-assisted nuclear reactions. And this theory has become accepted in some parts of the mainstream scientific community as a legitimate explanation for what's really happening in cold fusion phenomena. Now, about 39 minutes into this interview, and I've suspected this for quite some time, folks, and I've suspected that this may indeed be one of the reasons that cold fusion was so very early on suppressed by mainstream science while it went deeply underground. Let's recall that the cold fusion phenomena, while it was rejected overwhelmingly publicly in the United States, in countries like France or Germany or Japan particularly, cold fusion began to be studied very, very closely and very carefully. It was given a great deal of subsidization, in fact, in Japan by MITI, their Ministry of Trade. So it was a phenomenon that was taken seriously elsewhere, and I suspect in this country as well, although it went deeply black. But about 39 minutes into this video, Mr. de Geis points out that with these types of theories of cold fusion, the idea of actually creating gold and other precious metals, and please note this is something that he himself says on that point in the interview, meaning silver, platinum, palladium, iridium, and so on. These things can possibly be created from baser elements through the process of lattice-assisted nuclear reactions or cold fusion. So in other words, he's talking alchemy. Cold fusion is a kind of alchemy. And if there is a process, expanding theoretically the implications of what this means, if you can take a process like that that would do that, and then find or figure out a way to make it work en masse, then you could conceivably create massive amounts of the stuff, and that would add yet a fourth layer of obfuscation to the figures of gold available in the world. Now, I last week suggested certain ideas as to why gold would be sought as a commodity, and again, I suggest similar ideas in the upcoming book, Covert Wars and Breakaway Civilizations. But the key here, in my opinion, is that discovery, if you want to call it that, by David Hudson back in the 1980s and 90s, that if you actually consume gold, actually burn it, not just melt it, but actually burn it, totally consume it, it reduces to a new state of matter which loses 44% of its mass while retaining its chemical properties. And of course, when you say that, you're talking contrabary, or if you will, anti-gravity. And that would make it, therefore, a very, very valuable commodity to be able to produce. And it would also make it a commodity whose amounts you would obfuscate. So things are looking very interesting, folks. Like I say, I don't think that we need to be too concerned about China moving to a gold standard immediately. I think what I am suggesting here is that the real story about gold is very, very different than what is being talked about publicly in the financial markets, on television, and so on and so forth. I think the real story, believe it or not, is an alchemical one. Anyway, that's it for this week, folks. News and views from the Nefarium. I'll see you on the flip side, and God bless everybody.